I stood by and allowed my wife to almost end my son's life. I was happy she did it. My son was very troubled. If you have seen the movie We Need to Talk About Kevin, it will really help to understand what I'm talking about. The only difference is that in the movie, the boy appears normal to his father and only reveals his true nature to his mother. With my son, he didn't have that mask. His insane behavior was the same with everyone. From the day he was born, my son just came out wrong. He was planned. My wife and I tried to get pregnant and were ecstatic when he was born. He was wanted and loved. We showered affection on him and really tried to give him a happy childhood. But from the day we brought him home from the hospital, he was miserable. He cried for 13 months straight. I'm not exaggerating, 13 months without a break. He cried until he had no voice left and kept crying. You could see his little face scrunched up and no sound coming out, totally hoarse. There were times he would literally be crying in his sleep. I've never seen or heard of any other kid able to do that. We brought him to doctors, specialists, tried changing his diet, held him, rocked him, toys, swaddling, music, mobiles, everything we could think of. Nothing worked. 13 months of grating, grinding, no sleep hell. Once he got over the crying stage, we thought we were out of the woods. But it quickly became clear that for some unknown reason, he was just angry at being alive. I never saw that kid have a genuine, joyous smile once in the time I knew him. I saw him grin a vicious, horrible grin many times, taking a perverse pleasure from causing pain or suffering or breaking a rule, but a smile from real pleasure at something nice? No, never. Not once. He had no interest in anything positive. He was fueled by hate, and everything he did was bent toward that. As soon as he could walk, his mission in life was to destroy things. He would break or try to break anything that came in his range, smash it, chew it, throw it in the toilet, whatever he could. After a while he figured out how to get his diaper off and took great pleasure in pooping and pissing anywhere he could. After a while he figured out he could hide it, grinding it into carpets, making it even more of a problem to clean and making the house stink. When he got older, ages 9 to 15, he would piss and poop in our bed, until we got a lock on our door and he wasn't able to get in anymore. Then he'd just take a dump in the hallway in front of our room. He never grew out of it. As he grew older, he became more and more unmanageable. We had to install a door and lock on the kitchen because he would steal knives and use them to gouge the walls and furniture or chase people with them. When he was 10, he stabbed me pretty good in the hip. I still have the scars. As he grew older, he grew darker. He moved into setting things on fire, and torturing local animals. There was a stray dog that hung out around the park near our house. My son blinded it in one eye with a fork. He would dip cats' tails in gasoline and light them on fire. Of course, we had the kid in therapy. He saw a psychiatrist twice a week, and had God knows how many different medications prescribed to him over the years. Nothing worked. Therapy didn't work. Meds didn't work. Nothing worked. He was like a poison cloud of hate and fury lashing out at anything in his reach. When my son was 16, my wife got pregnant again. I can't tell you how different our reaction was. Instead of joy, we felt horror. In the end, we decided that my wife would have the baby, and if it turned out evil we would put it up for adoption. We knew we just couldn't do it again with another child like our son. We had a daughter. She was normal. Suddenly we saw what our lives should have been like the whole time, how things would have been had our son not been himself. She was happy. She was normal. I can't describe the relief and happiness that we both felt. I don't have the words for it. When we brought our daughter home he started acting out even more. I didn't think it was possible, but he took it up another notch. At this time he was 17, and we were having blowout screaming matches daily. After the birth of our daughter, my relationship with my son was almost entirely gone. Our only real interactions were screaming at each other. My wife was even worse with him, she just had nothing left. He started spending more and more time out of the house, which was a blessing for us. I have no idea what he got up to out in the world, but we were just happy it wasn't being inflicted on us. As a consequence of our son's behavior, we had invested heavily in locks around our house. All of the cheap, thin interior doors in our home had been replaced with thick, dense wood doors that couldn't be kicked through, equipped with keyed locks that my wife and I carried keys to. I was not locking my son in rooms like a prisoner. He had free reign of the house and could come and go as he pleased. My wife and I would lock ourselves in rooms to protect ourselves from him. He had turned us into prisoners in our own home. On the day in question, I had fought with my son in the morning and he had left the house in a rage. My wife and I were enjoying some peace and quiet in the kitchen while our daughter napped in our bedroom. And then my daughter began crying. Any parent who has young children can tell you, you get used to your child's cries and you can tell after a while what they need. They cry differently if they are hungry, or need changing, or are just restless and want to be held. This cry was none of those things. This cry was terror. The second we heard it, my wife and I were both up out of our chairs and running to the room. The door was locked, of course, and it took a few seconds to get the right key and get it open. My son was in the room. We lived in a bungalow, and he had climbed in the window to get to her. He was standing over her crib with a steak knife in his hand. I have no idea where he got it, it wasn't one of ours. We controlled our knives very carefully and always kept them in locked drawers. I think he may have stolen it from one of our neighbors' houses. He had broken her skin twice already, once in the belly area and once on her arm. I could see blood running down. When I entered the room he was dragging the back of the knife down her face, not cutting, almost tickling her with it, teasing her while she screamed. He looked up at us and smiled. Before I knew what I was doing, I was already moving, running to put myself between them. I didn't think about it, I just moved instinctively. Even with that, my wife got there faster. It was like a movie on fast forward. She got to our son and bashed his hand away, knocking the knife across the room and then shoved him with her whole body weight, so hard that he flew away from the crib and bounced off the wall. I picked up my daughter and held her while my wife screamed us. The worst part was the look on my son's face as he stood there. Just nothing. Blank, dead, there was nothing in his eyes, no emotion. He looked like an alien to me. I watched my wife take a step toward him. I could have reached out and stopped her, but I didn't. She stepped forward again, very close to him. I could have stopped her again. But I didn't. She waited, looking at him for maybe 3 to 5 seconds without moving. And then she punched him in the face. Now until this point, you may have been picturing my wife as a typical woman, small frame, dainty, delicate. This is not the case. My wife does have a small frame, but dainty and delicate she is not, never has been since I've known her. Since her early teens, my wife has been a boxer. MMA didn't exist back then, but karate and boxing were big in those days, and my wife was a very talented amateur. Neither of us had ever laid a hand on our son in anger before, but something broke in her that day, and all the years of anger and pain and sorrow and frustration just came pouring out. When she hit him, his head snapped back and blood started pouring out of his nose. He hardly reacted, he just looked at her with this shocked expression like he didn't know how to process what had just happened. She waited another second. And then she hit him again. I could have reached out and stopped her. I could have dragged her out of the room, taken her away, calmed her. I didn't. I just stood there and watched while she systematically started to pound him to a pulp. Every time he brought his hands to cover one part, she would blast him somewhere else, body, head, over and over. He started screaming, crying out, yelling for her to stop. It's the most genuine reaction I'd ever seen him have to anything in his whole life. But she wasn't stopping. I watched her ramping up, hitting harder, faster, working him like a heavy bag. He tried to swing at her and she slipped him easily. She was on autopilot, sinking down into her training. I stood there watching for a minute. Then I turned my back on them and took my daughter out of the room. I brought my daughter to the kitchen and gave her a bath in the sink. I found that he had cut her a third time on the sole of her foot. All the cuts were superficial. I cleaned her up and held her until she calmed. I put polysporin and band-aids on her cuts. In our bedroom, I could hear my son screaming, calling my wife horrible names, telling her he would cut her head off and abuse her corpse. After a while, I didn't hear him saying anything anymore, didn't even hear him crying out. I assumed that he must have been knocked out. But I could still hear her beating him. That went on for a long time. Long enough for my daughter to drift off to sleep in my arms. Finally she came out and sat down across from me. Her hands were swollen and red. Her face and arms were splattered with blood. Her chest was heaving. We just stared at each other without saying anything. After a while I asked her, "Is he dead?" She looked back at me and answered, "I hope so." I nodded. I understood how she felt perfectly. I felt the same. I didn't know what to do, so we just sat there waiting silently. Eventually my wife started crying and went to take a shower. I just stayed where I was holding our daughter. After a long while, I heard moaning and sobbing coming from our room. It turned out that my son wasn't dead. I went in to see how bad it was, and it was pretty bad. I've never seen a more merciless beating laid onto anyone, before or since. He was lying on the floor, rolling around with blood leaking out of his face, lying in a pool of vomit. His nose was squashed flat out across his face, both of his eyes were completely swollen shut and starting to blacken already. I could see that a couple of his fingers were bent out at weird angles and he had pissed his pants. I think he must have been missing teeth, but I couldn't see any on the floor and I couldn't see inside his mouth. His lips were all puffed up and swollen. Have you ever seen a lawyer who was so good you were lost for words? I had been the victim of a road rage incident when I was in my 20s. Long story short, I was in a left turn only lane, the perp was in the right turn only lane, and he wanted to go left. I made my turn, without ever noticing him, as there weren't very many cars on the road, and went into a restaurant to pick up my dad's dinner. He followed me in, kicked the chair out from under me, and kicked the crap out of me while screaming, "Do you know who I am?" Luckily, one of the waiters got his license plate number. I had 8 broken ribs, a fractured cheekbone, and he had ruptured all of my stitches from my gallbladder surgery that I'd had 2 weeks prior. He tried to have me arrested for assault, saying that I threw him against his car. I'll come back to that. At my first court appearance, the prosecutor took me into a room and wanted me to drop the charges against this guy. I obviously refused. The prosecutor said, "You are 22, you work as a barber, and you live with your parents. You are nothing. Jamie, the perp, is a pillar of the community, and is the child psychologist for the county, so I'd think real hard over this." I couldn't believe it. He was talking to me as if I wasn't the victim here. I did point out that I had brought a witness, the waiter, as well as notarized affidavits from several people who were in the restaurant at the time, and CCTV footage from the restaurant, too. She refused to allow them to be admitted. Wasn't she supposed to help me? The judge wanted me to let the perp have my car fixed by some unlicensed guy, whom he had treated when he was in school. He broke a window and keyed the door. I agreed to an estimate, but I was going to get my own estimate as well. My sister used to work as a legal secretary, and she took me to one of her old bosses. We went over all of the evidence, and he agreed to come with me for the second court date. So, at the next date, the prosecutor called me back to a private room, before going into the courtroom, again trying to force me to drop the charges, but still wanted me for assault. My lawyer, Mark, said, "So you say that my client threw Jamie over the hood of his own car and held him against a wall with his right arm, correct?" The prosecutor said, "That's what Jamie told me." "Mark, Jamie, how tall are you? Jamie, 6'3". Mark, Cole, how tall are you? Me, 5'8". Mark, Jamie, you are a big guy, easily close to 230 pounds, while Cole weighs 150 pounds, so how could he throw you? Prosecutor, that's not important. Mark, I disagree. Jamie, you said in your sworn statement that Cole held you up against the wall with his right arm. Are you certain that you want to say that? Jamie, that guy is a wild animal. Who knows what those people are capable of? Mark, well, Cole had emergency surgery 2 weeks prior to the incident, on his right side, and still cannot lift that arm past shoulder level. No, thanks to you. Also, he's left-handed. Checkmate. Jamie, at this point, jumped up and started screaming about how important he was, and I was just white trash. When Mark stood up, looked down at him, he's 6 feet 7 inches, and said, "Sir, you might have convinced this prosecutor that you're somebody special, but I have, in my briefcase, a filing, ready to go to the state board, along with all the evidence from this case, as well as sworn observations about your general behavior from your fellow psychologists and some of your neighbors. You will never be able to work again once I'm through with you, so I suggest that you sit the F down and admit that you lied and that you beat this white trash guy for no reason." Then, he turned to the prosecutor and said, "How dare you assume that someone is guilty because they're not from this crappy town? What does that prove, or are you just bored and lazy? Jamie had to pay for all of the damage done to my car, as well as the ambulance service, medical costs relating to everything that he did to me, and the damage he did to the chair in the restaurant. All of my charges were dropped and expunged." Mark usually handled divorce cases, but he had way too much fun that night. Flash forward a few years, when I was at a luncheon with my mom. We ran into a friend of hers, who is also a child psychologist for another district. My mom mentioned my case, and the woman said, "We've all been waiting for that idiot to get knocked down a few pegs for years. He's a nightmare to deal with, but he did lose his job shortly after your case was resolved. The district didn't want to have to pay out a small fortune if and when this guy blew his top again, so they forced him into early retirement."
I unintentionally cheated on my husband with my husband. I'm a 30-year-old woman, and have been married to my 36-year-old husband for 12 years, and we've been together for 16 years. Through the ups and downs of life, we've had an amazing relationship in every aspect. We even have 4 kids. It all happened on Reddit. A few months ago, I was scrolling and came across a post about one of my favorite songs, and enthusiastically commented. Someone then replied with a super witty response, and shortly after me. I accepted the invite and we started chatting. I learned that the person was a male in his mid-30s, lived in my area, and we shared many interests, passions and outlooks. Both of us chose to remain anonymous, as the internet is a scary place, but after a few days of frequent chatting, I realized I'm really attracted to this guy, without even knowing what he looks like. He was funny, smart, passionate, loved his kids and pets, and overall really charming. We never had any suggestive chats or anything, but I panicked, feeling guilty, confused and scared. Nothing like this had ever happened to me before. I loved my husband passionately all the years we've been together and couldn't imagine being with anyone else. The fact that I had a wet dream about this guy on Reddit shook me, and I decided to take action and tell my husband what's going on. We've always believed in openness and honesty as pillars of a marriage. Later that day, I received a message from the guy on Reddit. "You're an amazing person. Kind, loving, passionate, heartwarming. I'm extremely attracted to you, but I am married to a woman who is the light and essence of my life. I'm sorry, but I can't chat to you anymore." I was relieved, but a little hurt, even though I understood completely. So, I went to my husband that evening. Before I can say anything, he hands me his phone and tells me he has something to share with me. He instructs me to read the messages on the screen, while he tells me that he realized he is undeniably attracted to the internet stranger, but that I'm the only one he loves and that he just needed to be open with me. I take out my phone, open my chat with the Reddit guy, and hand it to my husband. He scrolls through it in confusion. Before realizing I'm the woman he has been chatting to this entire time, and he is the Reddit guy whom I found so attractive.
What is the darkest family secret you have discovered accidentally? That I'm probably a cannibal. Let me explain. My father wasn't around in my life, but my mother raised me well with her meager earnings and with the close guidance of my grandparents. My grandmother is still alive to this day and has to be the kindest, most wholesome person I have ever known. My grandfather was this badass country man. I grew up as a toddler watching old Clint Eastwood films, and I thought he was Clint Eastwood for while he looks a lot like him. He was my father figure, and taught me about hunting and fishing. He was a Depression-era kid and made sure we never went without and that we knew how to keep ourselves alive. As I grew older, I found out my granddad had did time and was actually a felon, and all the times we went hunting he could have been sent away for illegal weapon possession. He did time over crippling a dude at a party with a crowbar. I don't know all the specifics, something spurred on by drink. He was a rowdy man though, and very quiet, mumbled a lot, a habit I had to grow out of as I got older. He had his Adam's apple caved in during a bar fight and always had a raspy Daffy Duck tone to his voice. To sum it up, my grandfather wasn't exactly a saint. This isn't entirely about him though, as it gets much darker. My granddad had a group of friends he did redneck tough with, like hunting and fishing. By the time he was gone, the only one left alive in the group was the youngest friend and closest. We called him Texas. Texas was by far the most redneck person I ever met. Big 10-gallon hat, no shirt, and a Bowie knife on his waist just about everywhere he went. My granddad died off when I was in my mid-teens, and Texas took over in showing me the way. Man's man he was, smart man too, philosophy, art, music. He wasn't a one-trick pony. One heck of a cook too. Annually since before I was born we had 4th of July parties at his house where barbecue and catfish were served in abundance alongside a spectacular fireworks display of illegal fireworks brought in from states away, all in his backyard. Our story takes a dark turn and a family secret is revealed to me one night before one of my last hunting trips. It was right before an unexpected heart attack sent Texas to an early grave. As old men do on the weekends, Texas was drinking when my mom dropped me off at his house. I was gonna stay over, and then we were gonna hit the land early in the morning. As soon as mom left, Texas threw me a beer and we got to sitting around chatting with another friend of his. Eventually his friend leaves and things turn somber as Texas reflects on my granddad and how he missed him and how he thinks my granddad would really be proud of how I had been doing in life up till then. I asked him to tell me some stories about the good old days, and he shared a couple of tales about situations they got into doing one thing or another. Texas was a big and broad-shouldered man and had to pay court fees once for beating up 4 bouncers at a bar in Indiana. Stories like that were told. And then he lets this line slip out, I will never forget it. See, there's a lot of bad in this world, your granddaddy and I both knew that. Sometimes when we encountered bad folk, we made them disappear. You'd be surprised how much people taste like barbecue when done right. I had laughed it off having been a few beers deep at this point thinking it to have been a joke. However, years after his passing, remains were found in his backyard. The same backyard where we had the 4th of July cookouts for years. Where barbecue was served often.